All right, we are going to go ahead and get started as people make their way back to their seats. We have one final panel before you get to enjoy some good food and sun out on the dock. And as Duke mentioned, we are going to narrow the focus even more in this panel and really get into talking about some things that are going on in cities, and in particular, the bookend cities of Phoenix that's struggling with scarcity of water issues, and then looking at Houston and New Orleans who are dealing with the opposite issues of more inundation with water. So I will turn it over to our moderator, Laura J., who is with C40 Cities, and she can tell you a little bit more about what she does and who we're going to hear from today. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Beverly, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'll talk a little bit about C40, but I first want to get a sense from the audience of who lives in one of the cities along I-10. Raise your hand. All right, that's pretty amazing. I don't. I live in New York, so we have our own water challenges, but I grew up just up the Mississippi in St. Louis, so to me this all hits very home for me, so really excited about that. How many people it's your first time to Baton Rouge? For me, it's my first time to Baton Rouge. There we go. Okay, that's pretty good. I like that. This setting is, I think, so fitting and really beautiful, and I think the governor really spoke to that about how important it is. And so, as Beverly said, my name's Laura J., and I'm with C40 Cities. I'm the Deputy Regional Director for North America. And so for those of you who don't know who we are a membership organization of 96 of the world's largest cities working to tackle climate change. And so along the I-10, we work with New Orleans, Houston, and Los Angeles. We also work with Austin, though not along the I-10, it still has, I think, some similar challenges. And for us, we are at our core a peer sharing network. We bring together technical experts from around the world to really tackle a lot of the challenges that we're talking about today. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about how impactful those are and how those networks can be really useful. And for us, that's our bread and butter. And so it's really, really important for us to find some of those other collaboratives like the 10 Across to really work with, so that way we can have an impact in a larger section of the country beyond just the cities that we work in ourselves. And so part of that work, as well as we have a number of topical focused networks that really relate to a lot of the conversations we're having today. One is a network we have called the Connecting Delta Cities Network. And so actually 2/3 of the world's largest cities are located on coastal deltas. You know, historically, there's obviously that for a lot of economic reasons, and now and towards the future, that of course is addressing a lot of challenges. And so at C40, what we're doing is really bringing together those cities so that way they can learn from each other. And so that's everyone from Jakarta and Venice, Tokyo, you know, to New Orleans and New York. And Jeff can talk, has been involved in the past in his role in the city of New Orleans in that network. And what we've really found is by bringing together those groups of cities that are having common challenges, they can really innovate and advance solutions locally. And what we found, even in, for example, being in the city of Jakarta, we held a workshop there where we brought a number of cities, including New Orleans there, to actually speak with the vice governor about how flooding is dealt with in other cities. And as a result, Jakarta started to put in place a lot more green infrastructure solutions. And so those are some of the really tangible solutions that initiatives like 10 Across and C40 and 100 Resilient Cities, a lot of these network groups that we're talking about can really influence. We're also at C40 about to launch an urban flooding network that's going to look a little bit more at inland flooding, and also with water systems network and security that's going to look at kind of sourcing and some of the issues that we're going to get in a little bit more today. And so, as Beverly and Duke have been saying, we kind of started at the broad level earlier, and now we really want to bring it down to the city level and talk about projects within the cities and how we're dealing with the extremes of everything from drought to inundation, which is really the title of this panel today. So we have an amazing group of people here today, and really want to give a shout out to Jeff Abear, who just flew in from New York after being delayed, and so made it very last minute. So we're very happy to have him and Bill Fulton and Cynthia Campbell here joining us, representing areas of New Orleans, Houston, and Phoenix. So I'm going to start by having each of them just give a quick introduction to themselves and some of the work that they're doing, and then we're going to get into some more specific questions and then try to engage you as well So please think of questions as they're talking, and we'll have some more time for Q&A at the end. Bill, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice in Houston. I do want to say I live in Houston. Previously, I was the mayor of Ventura, California, which suffered from wildfires. My daughter went to college right near Santa Rosa, and my partner's family lives in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it's a pretty risky proposition even to invite me somewhere, because you never quite know. You never quite know what's going to happen. This is Duke. This is a great. Duke and I have been talking about this for a long time. This is a great idea. I've lived in both LA and Houston. I've done a lot of work over the years in Phoenix. I spent a lot of time in San Antonio, thanks to Secretary Cisneros, and also to in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. So this is really great. The debate we are engaged in along with other researchers and philanthropies in Houston to try to lay down a foundation of data and solid information that everybody can work off of. This has been the hardest thing, and I think the way we're working with others at Rice, the engineers at Rice, and so forth. But I think that what we're struggling with, which is not atypical, right? And Jeff and I have talked about this, is we're trying to see if there is a way to move Houston to something less than a 100% engineering solution to this flooding problem, right? Which has pretty much been where Houston has been in the past. And what we've tried to argue is that in addition to engineering solutions, there are also green infrastructure solutions, and there are, I hesitate to use the R word, but in regard to Houston, but floodplain regulation solutions, right? And that all these things have to work together. It's an enormous cultural change for Houston. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. One is that as the Corps and the Harris County Flood Control District sort of pull all of their projects off the shelf and say, okay, let's build all this stuff now, one of the things we have to do is question whether those are the right projects. And one of the things we find oftentimes is that projects are built with the idea of protecting undeveloped land so it can be developed, right? Which is kind of the whole point of Houston, right? And questioning whether or not that's the project that should be built as opposed to a project that protects people who already live in houses that got flooded is a surprisingly difficult conversation. Another example is the way the city is having to deal with floodplain regulations. So if you are Mayor Sylvester Turner, who's a very skilled politician, and you were looking at the political center, you'll find when I tell this story, and then I'll shut up, is that he found the political center. Whether the political center is the right place to be is a good question. So subsequent to Harvey, Mayor Turner promoted the idea of imposing the regulations that are currently on the 100-year floodplain to the 500-year floodplain, which consists primarily of elevating all the new houses about 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain, 500-year flood level. He got enormous pushback from developers for that, and he got that through the council by a 9-7 vote. So then you could build in the 500-year floodplain with elevated houses. The first project that came through was a golf course which was being subdivided into houses in the 500-year floodplain, which the city council approved, right? So immediately everybody says, how can you build houses in the floodplain, on a golf course in the floodplain, after having a knockdown, drag-out fight over increasing regulations to do just that? So you can see that it's very difficult for Houston to have this conversation, but there is an inflection point after Harvey, and we'll see how much things really change. That's kind of where we are in Houston right now.
No, that's great, and we work closely with the city of Houston, and I think that within the city itself, there's beginning to be a bit of a shift in even talking about the word climate change, which is big steps, but I think there is also a door that needs to be, that we have to get through to actually make some changes in the time period where people really remember what has happened.
Traditionally, as you can imagine, in Houston, it's perfectly fine to talk about the consequences of climate change. You just can't talk about the cause.
Right.
Right. I will say one other thing is that we have one of the difficulties we're struggling with is fighting the last war, right? We're going to get really good at figuring out how to protect Houston against the next Hurricane Harvey, and then the next hurricane is going to be completely different.
Right.
Right. It's going to wipe out the ship channel or something dreadful, and
Exactly.
and that is a risk that we are confronting in our current planning.
Well, that's, I think, a very good segue to have Jeff introduce himself and the work that he's been doing, not only in New Orleans, but at the Water Institute of the Gulf.
Thanks, Laura. Jeff Abear, Vice President for Adaptation and Resilience here at the Water Institute, and I have to say I'm happy to be here. Didn't know if I was going to make it, but I think it's quite fitting that I was trapped because of an inundation of water in New York that, frankly, I think a few people died yesterday. So I'm very happy to have arrived about 15 minutes ago to sit with you.
We're very happy to. So.
Yeah. I'm going to pick first on what Bill just said, because we have had this conversation about Houston before, and I think it'll give a good context to the work in New Orleans. Historically, New Orleans, like Baton Rouge, like where we're sitting today, the city, in fact, most of the historic cities and towns in coastal Louisiana were built on high ground. So we're next to the river here, where the city of New Orleans was developed really for the first 250 years of its history, was on high ground. Next to the river, and sort of developed along that crescent and that spine of the city in what we call today downtown, uptown, Marigny, Bywater, and those neighborhoods. At about, debatably, but really pushing forward after World War II with suburban post-war development like you see in the rest of the United States, you see that here in Baton Rouge as well, we decided that we would overcome nature. We would build into the marshland that was the natural drainage system for the city for the first 250 years, and we would create engineered solutions to help us grow. That worked for the first bit of that period, the first sort of, I would say, 40 or so years of the post-war period in New Orleans, and I would say similar in Houston. And then Katrina happened. And the reliance on a wholly engineered solution showed what can happen in engineered solutions when there is no redundancy. And so the arc in New Orleans over the past 12 years since Hurricane Katrina has been really thinking about how to create an integrated infrastructure program that relies not just on hard gray infrastructure, but blue and green infrastructure and nature-based solutions and other things to add additional capacity to an engineered solution that, frankly, is at its capacity. Working with C40, we were able to really look at and analyze a lot of what was going on in New Orleans, a lot of data, and understand that in New Orleans, South Louisiana, South Texas, and a lot of parts of the country, no matter what we talk about the cause of it is, the conditions are changing. We're going to get more precipitation. We're going to have more flooding, and it's going to be more regular, and it's going to be more intense. And we came to that realization in 2015, really 2014, leading into 2015, that this was going to happen. And so we decided in New Orleans to pivot from just thinking about Hurricane Katrina as a singular event and thinking about we need to recover from Hurricane Katrina to think about if we look at the projections of the next 50 years, looking in 5, 10, 25, and 50-year segments, what are the challenges going to be? And how can we redesign the city to add capacity to what those challenges are, not a singular point like Katrina? Because those who study these types of events can tell you Katrina was a singular event. There may be or may not be anything like Katrina ever again, but there will be something else that does not have the exact DNA of Katrina. And so if you attach yourself to one event, you're going to set yourself up for failure. The same thing in New York after Hurricane Sandy. I would say this is going to be a challenge in Houston, a challenge in Puerto Rico, and other places, that you're not just thinking about that one incident. You're thinking about the many challenges that are going to come your way over the next 50 years or so. How did we get there? It took a lot of data, a lot of understanding of data to inform planning. And so we developed a resilience strategy that launched in 2015, and a climate adaptation strategy, which we did with C40, which launched in 2017, to really take the data, use the data, analyze it to create plans for the future and infrastructure. So, as I said, we're about 12 years out from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. The Water Institute is playing a role in this today, where we are in sort of the 6th year of really getting on the ground infrastructure. So we've gone from analysis to strategy, strategy to plan, plan to implementation, and now those projects are about to get out of the ground. Many of the faces I see in the audience today are actually contractors on those projects, and so I'm sure you're ready for those contracts to be signed so you can get to work, but that should be starting up this fall. So we've gone through this cycle, and what I like to say is, whether it's unfortunate or fortunate, we're now having to go back and learn from the past, because in the past, the communities in South Louisiana, like many coastal communities, was built to adapt to the environment. Here, houses were raised from environmental conditions. We had pitched roofs and high ceilings to deal with the heat. For passive ventilation, we did not build in floodplains. We built in areas that were high ground, which had been proven to be high for a long time, including Native Americans who settled along the high ground way before Europeans came and settled in this part of the world. And so that combination, and really thinking about, wait, we actually sort of understood how to do this before. How can we take the technology of today and the learnings from a long time ago to understand how we can live better with this environment that continues to change? So that's sort of been the trajectory. The last thing I would say, to pitch Laura and other groups, and I think what's coming out of the 10 Across with Duke's leadership, is many ways that this work was able to accelerate in New Orleans was because of our relationships with other cities and understanding what other cities are doing and co-designing solutions with other cities. So a lot of the work that we have done has been designed and is about to go into construction in New Orleans, has been deeply informed by work in the city of Rotterdam, in the city of Copenhagen, in Milwaukee, and other places. And those networks are very, very key, which is why Bill invited us over to Houston not long ago, and we continue that collaboration. But learning between peers is really, really important in this work. You don't have to do it alone.
No, I think that's great, and really important points. And you know, I think that especially the point about the singular event not being kind of the end point, but I think what's also really valuable about, not valuable, but the reality of those events is that it does catalyze action, and it changes minds, right? So as we're talking about in Houston, people are talking about climate in a different way than they were before Harvey. Just to get a sense, how many people here from Houston were there during Hurricane Harvey? All right, just a few. How about in New Orleans from Katrina, who were there during Katrina? All right, so this half of the room, a lot of New Orleander. And I lived in New York during Hurricane Sandy, and I think that living in a city when that happens, it definitely, you feel the shift in mindset whenever there's a major disaster. And that obviously can't be the end point, but I think it's a valuable thing for all of us in the room to think about how involved were we before those and how that really got us motivated. And then on the other side of that, how many people here are from drought-prone cities? All right, there we go. So that's going to turn us to Cynthia, who's from the city of Phoenix. As we look at the other end, this, you know, the title of this panel is Too Much Water and Too Little Water. And so we're really looking at the extremes across the I-10. And so Cynthia, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and what's happening in the city of Phoenix.
I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm the Water Resource Management Advisor for the City of Phoenix, so I manage a portfolio of water resources that serves 1.7 million customers in the City of Phoenix, not the entire metropolitan area, but work very closely with my counterparts in other cities within the metropolitan area. It's interesting to sit here and listen to the perspectives from Houston and New Orleans, and I know many of you kind of now turn to me and go, oh, she's really toast, because that's Phoenix. They've got no water. Well, I'm here to say, as Sarah said, Phoenix is open for business and we are still growing. We are the 5th largest city in the United States. And our water portfolio is robust. But there's some caveats to that. Phoenix, we like to say, was built for drought. And that's something that kind of sounds a little pithy, and it's like, what does she mean? I don't get it. Well, when you move to a city like Phoenix, whether you're from New York or California or you're from any place else, you know what you're walking into. You walk in, if you don't know what you're walking into, you know that after you've spent the first 90 days in Phoenix and it hasn't rained, that you've walked into the middle of the desert. So we live in a desert. We don't have dramatic weather events, which we like to advertise, that makes us very secure for all of for data, for other kinds of things. We don't have hurricanes, we don't have earthquakes, but we do have fires, although not near the city. What our perspective is, though, is that because people who live in Phoenix, whether they're from Phoenix or from somewhere else, and I will tell you most people are from somewhere else, of the people who kind of raise their hand that live in these drought areas, how many of you were born in those drought areas? Not nearly as many. Some. I was actually born in East St. Louis, so I'm very familiar with this river too. This was in my backyard when I grew up, and I wasn't used to a place that didn't have a lot of water. I am now. But what I mean is that people live a different way. So they're not waiting for the next hurricane that might happen this year or next year or in 20 years or never. And climate change is not something that we talk about a lot, even though it certainly impacts Phoenix. But it's something that it's kind of like the other shoe that's always been waiting to drop. So you live in a desert, you're very conscious of water, you're always thinking of ways. Phoenix has been planning for 100 years for the mega drought that we're in. And whether we call it climate change, which is also a very unpopular term in the state of Arizona, although the city of Phoenix embraces it, whether you call it climate change, whether you call it mega drought, or my new favorite word, aridification, it's all the same, and the reaction has got to be the same. We have to have a robust portfolio that supports development, that supports and sustains the citizens we have. So that's the challenges I face, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of the things that we've done. But I would suggest for those of you who look at Phoenix and say, oh, poor Phoenix, it really is at the brunt end of climate change. I would suggest to you to maybe rethink that, in the sense that, as you've pointed out, in New Orleans and in Houston, people have had to make changes in what they think is the new normal. People are having to make adaptations as to where you can build and how you can build. In Phoenix, that part's not changing, in terms of, we know we're in a desert, and if we run out of, if we would run out of water, nothing is fundamentally going to change in terms of, we just keep managing what we have and managing and squeezing out the last drop. So the question becomes is when do we start implementing the other things that we have planned to squeeze the efficiencies out of the water resources that we have? And we have a long way to go, a long way.
Yeah, but I think that even, that's the importance of some of these networks as well, because as Phoenix has been planning for this for years and years, we're actually working now on helping the city of Cape Town, which we all know is in a serious drought, by connecting them with these cities that are like Phoenix and LA, that have been dealing with this for many, many years and have been thinking through it. But then also those cities that are newer to it, because this is the new normal in places that it wasn't previously. And that is where it's so important to connect. So I want to hear a little bit more about some of the specific solutions that all of you are working on within your cities. And Bill, in the lead up to this, we talked a little bit about, how in Houston there's this reality of there's either too much water or there's not enough water, right? And so the solutions on the ground need to be ones that address both. And I know the governor kind of spoke about this briefly this morning about how the commonality of it can sometimes have a similar solution. And so wondering from your perspective, and we'll ask the others on the panel as well, or what are some of those common solutions that address both inundation and drought that we can touch on for the
Right. Well, I want to point out that one of the things that we probably need to talk more about in Houston is that we have had extreme weather events of both types. You know, we often talk about the storms that we've had, beginning with Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, which was the most severe rain event ever before Harvey. But, you know, we had Tropical Storm Allison, we had Rita, we had Ike. Then in the last 3 years, we had 3 500-year floods. In between, we had a drought, right? Such a severe drought that my endowing donors, the Kinders, the other day committed $70 million to restoring Memorial Park, which is one of the signature parks in Houston, which was completely damaged by the drought. And I have to say, one of the things that we are not talking about, I mean, this I think is a deficiency of what we're doing in Houston right now, is we are talking a lot about what to do with too much water. We are not talking very much about what to do with too little water. And so we, in a certain way, you know, Hank Ovig came to Houston recently, and he said, you don't plan for a disaster, you plan for the future, right? And I think that was a very powerful statement to make, and I think people in Houston are just waking up. I don't really have a good answer to your question, because I think a lot of people are just waking up to the idea that resiliency means more than protecting houses from being flooded, right? Resiliency means a whole wide range of things so that a city can withstand all kinds of shocks and stresses, some of which are foreseeable, some of which are not. And what we've tended to do in Houston is the engineering town. I mean, there's more engineers in Houston than in any other city in the world, right? So that kind of drives how we think. But we tend to think in an engineering way about, okay, we'll fix this problem this way, we'll fix this problem this way, we'll fix this problem this way, rather than thinking, how do we create a more resilient whole? So I think we're not thinking about it the way we should be in Houston.
Yeah, Jeff, same question to you.
Yeah, I would say from the 12 years of working in sort of post-Katrina New Orleans, it's very much like what Bill said. I mean, it wasn't an easy lift. I mean, there is a continuous, I would say, fight to ensure that people understand what the challenges are and the types of solutions that can actually help. So I'll give an example. Drought conditions in the soils that we have in South Louisiana, it's terrible for many reasons, because one of the most for the built environment is when drought sets in our sort of, I would say, moist soils, it compacts. And so this is something that people don't talk about in New Orleans, even though the same time you had it in Houston, we had it in New Orleans. When you have the compaction of the soils, when drought sets in, roads collapse, foundations collapse, because there isn't enough moisture in the soil to retain the balance of what it needs to be for that soil to be stable. One of the things that we've done in the engineered city of New Orleans is we have overpumped for years. And so not only do we have drought conditions that are natural, we have unnatural man-made drought conditions because we've pumped literally all of the water out of the soil, which has added to the subsidence that you have in New Orleans. And so the pivot from understanding that the security that people think that they have is the same thing that's ruining their foundation and ruining the streets and collapsing the pipes, which, by the way, are leaking 40% of the drinking water into the ground. And aside from that, once you correct all those problems on the pipes, you then create another drought condition, right? And so all this is being modeled by scientists as we move forward. But being able to move from the reality that the engineers and the scientists can see and the communication so that people can understand what it is and make the changes that are necessary, I think it's a big challenge in a place that is so highly engineered like New Orleans. So over the past decade and really over the past 6 years, we've made the first steps, particularly in the Gentilly neighborhood of the city, where there's a big project that's rolling out a series of water gardens and reclaiming streetscapes to convey water, to not only convey water when we have heavy downpours, but also to retain water for the stability of the soil, because we need it for the subsidence issue. So this is all for us in New Orleans, and I would say for Louisiana as a whole. This is an experiment, a learning process for us. We are not, I would say, where we need to be. There's still a lot of work to be done. I think there's a lot that Houston can learn from New Orleans' experience, because New Orleans is such a engineered city like Houston. But we have taken the first steps, and I've always believed that you can't really, in order for people to understand what you're talking about, you have to demonstrate it. And so once the projects get going and once people can see the changes, I think then you'll have a lot more buy-in, but you have to take the first step. And I think that's what's most important. I'll say that, one of the big things that we did in New Orleans that I would say many cities should do if they haven't already, is 3 years ago we created a position called Urban Water Manager. And that person, that is their job, to really think about and look at that. And Tyler Anthrop is here from the city sitting in the back, and that's his job. That's what he's supposed to do, is help us think through these issues and monitor those things so that we're making the right decisions. And I think that it's going to take a long time. We've taken the first steps, but it's not an overnight solution.
Well, I think this really leads as well to the themes we talked about earlier this morning about how the solutions, a lot of the solutions are out there, and the challenges really relate to governance, or they relate to politics or financing, that kind of underline all of that. But I also think that it shows that any on-the-ground solution that happens, whether it's in a city or other places, it can't just be solving one challenge, right? It can't just be answering one question. It needs to be looking much more holistically. And Cynthia, wondering kind of in Phoenix how the city has, given the realities that the city is in and has known that it's been in for a while, how has it worked to address multiple challenges within maybe a specific project, and how can cities like Houston and New Orleans maybe learn from the work that Phoenix has done, even if it's looking at drought, but I think it's still is at its root trying to get to some of the same challenges that others are facing. Sure.
Well, I know one of our signature projects that we like to talk about, and I'm really glad that Sandy's here from Tucson, is in Phoenix, and in Arizona generally, Phoenix gets about 45% of its water supply from the Colorado River. Now, if you know your geography, no, we're not on the Colorado River. It's brought down to us through the Central Arizona Project, a 330-mile canal that runs from the river through Phoenix and all the way down and ends in the Tucson area. And one of our challenges is that we anticipate a shortage on the Colorado River system at some point. It's a function of when, not if. I think the most recent information that we've seen indicates that we could be looking at a better than 50% chance post-2020. But one of the things that we've learned about being avid watchers of drought planning and shortage planning scenarios is it changes. It goes back and forth, and it can change month to month to month. But one of the things that we knew we were going to have to prepare for is because we are such a surface water dependent city, and that was a choice that the city of Phoenix made back in 1980 when the state of Arizona enacted its Groundwater Management Act, which put into place restrictions in the urban areas on groundwater pumping so that we don't overpump our aquifers, because we were seeing rapid decline and actually potential obliteration of our aquifers if we just kept pumping. And so the city of Phoenix went all in on the Groundwater Management Act. We turned from being probably a groundwater dependent city into a city that uses 3% or less of our annual water supply from the ground. All the rest is surface. But that means that we're very dependent upon our surface water supplies. And so now one of our surface water supplies is threatened. And so we were looking for ways to maintain some level of stability and resiliency in shortage. And we have a very robust supply from the Colorado River, but we weren't utilizing all of it because we didn't need it for purposes of consumption. But what we also are well known for in Arizona is we do a little thing we call water banking. And so it sounds crazy when you come from other places. You're like, what do you do with water? We stick it in the ground. We take water and we put it in the aquifer and we leave it there. And it's not a bathtub, but it does stay. And so one of the things that Tucson has that is a really remarkable geologic feature is they have a couple of valleys near the Tucson metropolitan area that have vast aquifer storage capacity. And so Tucson has created quite the art form. And actually, it's really an engineering marvel to see the basins that they've created for basically aquifer storage. So you put water in and it percolates down into their aquifer and it stays. And they draw on their aquifer that is constantly being recharged, mostly through their own CAP water supply. But what we realized is, hey, we could probably send some of our water to Tucson down the canal, and they could put it in the ground. Now the challenge is getting it back because the canal doesn't run both ways. It only runs one way, south, but uphill as it is. So what we found was we could do a water exchange with Tucson. Tucson has a very robust CAP supply. And so what we plan to do is we've been sending water to Tucson now this is our 4th year. I think we've stored in excess of more than 45,000 acre feet of water in Tucson. And what we'll be able to do in years of shortage is, even though our supplies will be decreased, they still hopefully there'll be something. And so Tucson will allow us to divert some of its CAP supplies during shortage, and then it can pull out of the ground what we've stored there in Tucson. So it's an even water for water exchange. It's very simple and elegant, but it took a lot of doing. And it really was, it had to bend a lot of minds in Arizona to come around to it. That's one tangible way that we have. Another project that we've worked on more recently is we're finding on a broader scale that while the city of Phoenix was never a major player in the Colorado River system in the past in any significant way, we found that we really feel like we need to be more of a player and have a bigger seat at the table. Because if we're going to solve the issues, even the regional 7-state issues on the Colorado River system, it's going to take the water providers that have access to the water who are willing to give up parts of that water. So what we did a couple years ago was a deal with the Gila River Indian community, which Sarah Porter mentioned, has a vast amount of water. We had paid them to leave some of that water in our common reservoir, Lake Mead, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the entire system. It's water that won't ever come back to them. But they were willing to take the money instead. And so it was a deal, it was us, the state of Arizona, the Walton Family Foundation, which is an interesting idea too, as the NGOs are starting to play a much more active role in day-to-day things, and also the Bureau of Reclamation. So we all worked together and we were able to create system conservation, 80,000 acre feet in total, actually between 2 deals, that was left in Lake Mead, and actually has a tangible effect on the elevations in Lake Mead and keeps us out of shortage, so it benefits all of us.
And I think that that combination, especially between the last panel looking at it basin-wide to now this one really talking at the city level of how important regional collaborations are, issues of climate, and especially those of water, don't care about political boundaries, as Duke said earlier today. And we have to really think about some of those collaborative solutions. And I love so much this example of Phoenix and Tucson, because that at its core is what we and cities really need to be doing, is thinking outside of those boundaries and finding collaborative solutions. So I want to open it up to Q&A now, and I know we're getting close to lunch, so everybody's getting hungry. But if there's any final questions, and obviously the panel will be around later for any further questions. So open it up. Any questions for the group? All right, one question in the very back.
I'm Ben Stanley from Arizona State University. I just wanted to ask you a quick question about the difference between, disaster mitigation and actually recovering from a disaster. I thought that, it's pretty easy to respond to a disaster and get political will for it, but it's much harder when you're making preemptive changes and the public might not really recognize the value of those changes. I thought our panelist from Swiss Re made a really good point. Talking about Baton Rouge infrastructure, and if the city does invest in infrastructure, but that if there isn't a, if city invests in flood infrastructure, and then there's a big flood event, the public might not necessarily recognize that that investment, really saved the day. And so I was wondering, are there innovative ways for cities to sort of also, politically incentivize mayors and city councils to invest in this kind of infrastructure and then receive some sort of political benefit afterwards? I'm thinking anything from, developing better sustainability indicators that could then be, publicized to, prizes and so on.
That's a great question. Jeff, you want to start?
I'll start with one thing. I think it takes leadership. And it's a hard change, and it takes strong leadership to be able to work with different organizations to sort of move that change forward. I'm looking at Senator Landrieu, and this is right in her wheelhouse, having been the former chair of that committee, and the push that Senator Landrieu and Secretary Donovan really pushed to change the dynamic between just being post-disaster, but being pre-disaster mitigation, and actually getting Congress to move funding to pre-disaster mitigation. And I hate to bring it to this base level, but what makes people move on these things is when there's money. And so if there's the carrot of there is an incentive to do it and there's money to do it, that gets people moving. That was a big lift that Senator Landrieu did under her tenure. And hopefully there will be enough political will to continue those types of things in the future. That's one thing, having resources. And then the second thing is having good leadership. I would say in New Orleans, one of the things that made a lot of the work possible was the leadership of the mayor in really pushing down on these issues. And really getting it into the bureaucracy. So this wasn't an issue just for the folks who work on environmental issues. This was an issue for the Department of Public Works. This was something that the health department had to respond to. This is something that many different departments had to respond to. And then creating sort of a review mechanism by which when things are being designed, they can be judged against a rubric that takes all these things into account to get what Bill talks about is the holistic view of resilience. That takes leadership to structure that, but a lot of that leadership response came from the community saying and demanding we want something better than what we've had before. And I think you hear some of that going on in Houston now, and I think that's sort of the trajectory, but I cannot, on any panel, not talk about the importance of federal investment. Without federal investment, this country is not going to change.
And without federal policies that encourage the change, right? So we're at that exact. It's been what, 8 months since Harvey. We're at that exact inflection point where we're we're pivoting from recovery to rebuilding and rethinking the city, and particularly given the dynamic between the city and the state in Houston, which is probably not as healthy as the dynamic between the city and the state in New Orleans or Baton Rouge. There's tremendous inertia to simply rebuild things the way they were. Maybe put a few houses up higher, right? It's a strange sight in Houston to see a beautiful mid-century modern ranch house now 10 feet up in the air with a garage underneath it. Is kind of some people's solution, right? So I think we're really at that pivot point, and the question is, are we going to forget that? Because Harvey deeply affected 10% of the people and didn't really affect the other 90%. Are we going to forget and go back to the way it was before, or are we going to realize we are all at risk and we have to take on the kinds of solutions that Jeff talked about in New Orleans? We're really at that pivot point. We're going to have a bond election on the anniversary of Harvey on August 25th. I'm sure we'll get a huge turnout on August 25th, right? And the question is, are we going to use that money to pivot toward resilience, or are we just going to use that money to try to rebuild what we had before? I want to say one thing about what Jeff said about having congratulations on having an urban water manager. I have to say, having spent most of my adult life in California and having been the mayor of the largest city in Southern California that does not have imported water, it is astonishing to me that you didn't have an urban water manager, right? And I think one of the things that's going to happen as you see these extreme weather events and too much going back and forth between too much and too little, is that in the Gulf Coast and in the South, the cities are going to have to think very carefully about how they manage their water supply, just as the cities in the West have been accustomed to doing for decades.
All right, so let's take another question. There's one here, one here. Okay.
I'm sure a number of you have had this situation, but it's not uncommon in an urban area where the water resources issues related to flooding have resulted in structural and non-structural solutions. And generally, the structural solution, and of course Houston saw this, had certain operating conditions associated with it that would result in certain situations with the non-structural areas being flooded. And yet the governing authorities at some point in time would allow, as you mentioned, the golf course construction in those areas without any effort to recognize the operating conditions of the reservoir or whatever it was, or undertaking any mitigation to accommodate that development that it saw that it needed. How in the world do you create an environment where you make some incentive of your local governing officials to recognize situations like that?
Well, I think in the case of the golf course turning into the subdivision 6 months after Harvey, I think that's a good example of us not getting ahead of the curve and saying, hey, there's a golf course that is for sale, right? And getting ahead of the curve and doing whatever it takes to I think there is still in Houston not a sense of urgency about that kind of thing, and a reluctance because of Houston's peculiar, singular history, to not interfere with private real estate markets. Even at the cost of losing an opportunity like that. And like I say, that's the inflection point we're at. And it'll be interesting to see with the golf course turning in the subdivision whether there'll be blowback, right? Because what happened was the mayor pushed the regulatory system as far as he could on a 9-7 vote, and then got huge blowback for conforming with the new regulations, right? So I think the question is, will that lead to another, another, and it doesn't necessarily have to be regulating. As I say, sometimes it's just getting ahead of the curve and identifying those areas that you got to buy and you got to knock out and use for flood control purposes when they come aboard.
Cynthia, wondering from your perspective, from the other side of it, from Phoenix, are there any examples that maybe you could pull from that are looking kind of ahead, or that the city has really understood as these are places that either need to be preserved, or this is the way that land use needs to be developed in order to deal with the drought situation and the arid environment that the city's in?
Well, in some ways, some of that was done for us by the state in terms of the Groundwater Management Act, in the sense that you have to, in Arizona, if you're building in an urban area, in an active management area, you have to be able to demonstrate a 100-year water supply in order to build. And that can be challenging, and there have been a couple carve-outs and ways that folks have tried to find ways around it. I mean, that is always the quintessential challenge in a growing city, isn't it? Is that when development comes knocking, it's awfully hard to say no, even if you should, and that is a challenge. So luckily for us, in some ways, some of that political will came from the state, and actually those who were involved in it back in the 80s will tell you, well, actually the arm twisting came from the federal government, who said they wouldn't build the Central Arizona Project if Arizona didn't get control of its groundwater. So, you know, it sometimes has to do multiple levels of fortitude to overcome, I think, even those kinds of challenges.
No, I think that's really valuable learnings for, I think, everybody here. All right, do we have time for one more question, I think?
Yeah, we've got lunch coming, but we have, how about 1, 2 questions?
Two, all right, very quick, 2 more questions. Let's start over here.
Hi there. So I just moved to Phoenix 3 months ago, and I'm a native of Colorado, so I've been paying a lot of attention to this little battle between Colorado and Arizona over water policy. And I just wanted to think a little bit more about this metaphor of the water bank, because it strikes me that one of the things that might be going on there is that Colorado is saying, you've got all this money in the bank, and you know, and so you're not conserving, and we're conserving. And so how do you walk that line between money in the bank and conservation in terms of partners that have to rely on the same resource?
Right. What you're referring to is the issue with the Central Arizona Project and some of their recent activity and talking about how they do like mead conservation, and there was certainly a perception, if not a reality, on the part of the Upper Basin folks, states who felt that there was kind of a gaming of that system that was to their detriment. And there is a lot of truth in that, and we were not supportive of that particular policy. And it is difficult what you're talking about. How do you walk the line? I think the thing, though, to remember is that, and sometimes even in Arizona we have to remind ourselves, is that a lot of conservation was built in for us in 1980. I mean, when you can't build in a place unless you can show a 100-year water supply, where you, by state law, cannot exceed 10% water losses in your system. So when you said 40, Sandy and I both gasped and looked at each other. You can't do that by law. There's a whole plethora of things, but also this is where, and I will say we take advantage of it, and it's to our benefit that people who do live in the desert understand they live in a desert. So what we've seen over the past 30 years is that per capita water use has gone down over 30%, even though our population has increased 5-fold. It's stunning. And we study it ourselves and go, we don't really understand always why people are doing what they're doing, but they recognize they live in a desert. So we actually get a benefit out of that. But I would submit to you it's all relative in terms of what is conservation. And, you know, if I'm not paying for a lawn to be pulled out, does that mean I'm not doing conservation? We would say, no, we're still doing conservation. It's just, might look a little bit deeper, so.
All right, one final question before we break for lunch. Yeah.
I've been trying to think about, other than the I-10, what's the through line to this conversation? And it seems to me, undergirding all of this, there's an issue around how decisions get made and decision theory and advanced negotiation techniques, or whatever you want to call it. How much investment do you make in terms of your research and the work you do about how decisions get made in these very complex competing problems. I'm from Arizona. Phoenix and Tucson don't generally like each other at all. And anything done collaboratively is hard to get to. So that problem, that solution that Cynthia laid out was not easy to get at in a culture where there's natural and historical conflict. And that was probably easier than some of the other negotiations that have to happen. So how much investment is needed in that part of this? How do we solve these problems? And how much are all of you doing on this, or is there work being done on the kind of hidden part of getting to these creative solutions?
Laura, can I try that one a little bit? That is a really good point. And one of the things that I've said all along is, because I was involved from the very beginning of the Tucson Phoenix exchange, and we've done several other types of exchanges with a couple of different municipalities. And my biggest complaint all along is it's stunning to me that these kinds of transactions are created by serendipity. I will tell people stories about transactions that I've done after I had a conversation in a hallway with somebody from another city who said, oh, we had a problem with this. And I'm like, you didn't say anything to anybody. And we find we have this ability to do something very unique. And so one of the things that I've been working on with a group of partners, and it's still pretty early, is a technological tool, a computerized tool that will allow cities or other entities that have resources, whether those resources are water or infrastructure or other types of things that they can bring to the table, to basically put them into this technological tool, and the tool will generate transactional opportunities. I call it the Arizona Water Exchange Platform. And it's something that still isn't off the ground, so if somebody wants to steal the idea and run with it, go for it. But it would make it so much easier, because you're right. We cannot afford at this time to be able to say, well, Tucson and Phoenix don't have a good relationship. We don't have time for that. If there's anything that I think I'm learning about climate change, is not so much that we're changing a climate and going to a new place that we're all going to sit in, but that every single year the climate is variable. And so next year you could have a drought, and this year you could have a hurricane, and Houston's seen that firsthand. And so it's one thing to say, how do we adapt to a new normal? But how do we adapt to something where there is no more normal?
I'll try to be brief, but I think, no, we're not working on that, but you've stimulated some thoughts. I think there is a lot of peer learning to be done in the Southwest off of this, because I think there has been a lot of successful transactions, often preceded by decades of litigation, right? San Diego and Imperial is another good example, right? What I find in Houston on the flood control side is there is not a regional approach. The county judge, the county executive of Harris County has pointed that out, and he wants to try to fix that. There are hundreds of municipal utility districts that provide sewer and water service in Harris County that are disconnected from anything else. And I do think that the whole way the water and flood system is managed in metropolitan Houston is probably ripe for that kind of research and discussion.
I would just add,
one final point.
just really quickly, that sort of my response from the Water Institute perspective is better data, better data, better data. And all too often, decisions have been made in the past based on conjecture and not data. And so sort of our role is really in developing the best data and science for decision makers, and also we spend a lot of time on decision support tools. And that's sort of the two pieces from our perspective that we do, and we contribute to that conversation. But data is really, really, really important. Data changes, it's adaptive over time. And so have the ability to provide really good data to decision makers for them to make data-driven decisions is really, really important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really want to especially thank our panel. It's a really fascinating discussion, and as Cynthia said, let's go off and have the conversations in the hallway that really help create those regional collaborations. because that's really what it is about. All right, thank you so much, everybody.